Okay, let's see, make sure it's going. All right. So my name is Will Hewitt, and this is my final exam. Um, let's get right to it. So the first question that I chose to answer was question one. So it says Saturday, November 23rd, we received our first snow of the year. First part of the question: how did this first snow event relate or not relate to the article you read by Harmon? Um, And I said in Harmon's article, he argues that the larger percentage of winter storms occur in December and in March, so at the beginning or the end of the winter months. And certainly the storm that we received on November 23rd could be an indication of the continuation of that pattern. So I would say it does relate to his findings because it shows that we do have, although it wasn't quite December, it's, I think, as far as the season goes, it's the same kind of season. It shows that we do get more storms typically in December and in March than we do in January and February. And then the next part of that question is the November timing of this event related to the intensity of the snowfall we received. Um, and this one, I said that he talked about how the more intense snowfalls are in December and in March. Um, and I'd say that the snowfall was rather moderate as far as snowstorms go, the one that we had in November, as far as snowstorms in southern Michigan go. However, it was very early, um, not even being December yet. So maybe if it had been in mid-December, the intensity would have been much greater. The last part, how was the cold winter earlier this year? Was the cold winter earlier this year a potential factor? And I said the cold winter earlier this year indicates that the pattern is continuing, and that was supported by the snowfall in November. All right, question two. By what decade was the population distribution, settlement, and land use pattern in Michigan determined, and why? I talked a little bit about the history of the settlement, and then answered the question. So Michigan underwent three separate periods of settlement. The first period lasted from 1810 to 1850 and involved the settlement of the southern counties. The second period went from 1850 to 1910 and involved the northward settlement and the continued growth of the southern lower peninsula. And the third period lasted from 1910 to 1940 and consisted of a trend of urban dominance due to the heights of the automobile industry in Michigan and the economic promise that existed there. So 1940 is the decade in which the large shifts of settlements primarily ended and where the distribution and land usage that we have today stems from. So that last final phase of urban dominance. On the next part of that question, since this time, this pattern has not changed much. What does the settlement pattern still look like today? The population pattern is largely concentrated around the southeast lower peninsula. The areas surrounding Detroit, Lansing, and Saginaw are much more densely populated than the northern rural areas of the state. There's also a high concentration of population on the southwest coast and most notably in the Grand Rapids area down to Kalamazoo. Question number three. In what sequence was Michigan by type of tree lumbered and why? The sequence was first white pine. It was lumbered first. It was first priority because it was straight. It's easily cut into construction lumber, which was great for using for masts on ships. And in 1855, there were lots of white pine stands, and they were also around the pine stands and the pine forests, white pine forests. There were easily navigable rivers to help transport them. Next part of the question: what were the short-term and long? Oh wait, whoops. the next, sorry, the next type of tree to be lumbered was the hemlock and hardwood trees, and they gained importance around 1900 when pine logging had essentially become completed, and those types of trees were sometimes used for furniture, for the furniture industry. And the next part of the question, what were the short-term and long-term impact of the removal of Michigan's trees. So I said some short-term impacts was that, well, one, the lumbering was not environmentally conscious all the time, or any of the time that went that early in the lumbering industry, and enough dense underwood existed that allowed for fast-moving fire across the state. So there were a lot of fires in eastern Wisconsin, northeastern Wisconsin, and then in western Michigan, and across the state. Um, there were a lot of fires, and also left behind were dry, stump-filled wastelands due to the excessive um, removal of trees. Some long-term effects were that the pinelands, especially those in drier, sandier regions, were completely different than their primeval state. So these areas that were like such as the ones in the northern lower peninsula that were the most exploited, um, they are dominated today by birch, aspen, oak, and jack pine. And so these areas bear little to no resemblance of their primeval or native forest makeup. They're completely different. Um, okay. And then was there a major lumbering impact difference between the Upper Peninsula and the Lower Peninsula? Um, I said that the difference between the UP and the LP is that in the 20 years between 1935 and 1955, timber volumes in Michigan's Upper Peninsula decreased, and during that time, saw timber volumes in the Lower Peninsula increased. And the difference is because the bottom of the barrel, figurative barrel, had been reached in the northern Lower Peninsula for saw timber much earlier, and demand and industry activity decreased. Um, and there was early cutting and fires had been much worse in the northern Lower Peninsula, but the forests still came back. But that was after the big mills were gone. Um, and then, so after the big mills were gone, the timber regrew. And then in the UP, there was aggressive demand and cutting continued after the LP had reached the bottom of the barrel. They in the UP it was aggressive demand and cutting, and they continued to seek out the remaining older trees, older growth wherever they could find it, and they were cutting at a much faster rate than the wood was being replaced by the second growth stands of trees. But the comparison kind of stops there because the bottom of the barrel was never reached in the UP, and so the industry didn't go away, and the demand never disappeared because there was always trees. They never got to the bottom of the barrel. Question number 4. Which bulk commodities shipped on the Great Lakes are synergistic in the way that they are related and lead to a single product? Iron ore, coal, and limestone are used to make iron that is used in steel production. So the large quantities of these materials that need to be transported are really heavy and can be most easily accomplished on water. And that is why they are often transported on the Great Lakes. And the second part of that question, what is the role of the SULOCs in the synergy, and does it have temporal seasonal limitations? The SULOCs allow for the iron shipments to be transported from places like Minnesota and Canadian locations like Labrador, and I can't remember the other one they said, but some other Canadian locations, and let the iron ore go from there to southern lakes, Great Lakes cities like Chicago, Gary, Indiana, Detroit, Cleveland, Erie, and places like that. And then, what was the right question for? Oh yeah, does it have temporal seasonal limitations? So the navigation season for the locks ends on January 15th and restarts on March 25th. and that time is because I'm guessing because it's pretty cold and a lot of the water is frozen, and but um, they use that time for winter inspections and repairs that can't be made during the shipment season. Okay, that was question 4. I skipped question 5 and went to question 6. And question 6 is Andrea looked at the LQ of housing units in Michigan, and the question asks, can information from the Richard Group article amplify her findings? Why or why not? And I said that yes, they can. In Andrea's presentation, her map for the LQ of housing units is almost identical to the map of Figure 1 and in Figure 3 in Group's article. Andrea's findings were the Group 3 figure, the Figure 3 map being the map of retirees or elderly in Michigan, where they live. And Andrea's findings were that the counties with the highest LQ for housing units was in the upper lower peninsula and in the UP. And this at first doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, which she talked about, because the majority of people live in the southern lower peninsula. But we have to remember that those readings are divided and normalized by population. So while there are more housing units per so why are there more housing units per population in the north? Because Group's article shows that a large amount of the non-employment income is in the north as well. And he investigated and demonstrated that that is where the majority of the retirees in Michigan live. So retirees generally have 1 to 2 members per household. So the housing units may be less. The housing units may be less in the north than they are in the southern countries, but the population is so much less. So that therefore the LQ for housing units in the north is much higher than in the south. All right, question 7, the last one. So focusing on the LQs of median income, discuss. Focusing on the LQs of median income discussed used by Ann, Kevin, Garrett, and Kelly with their median income. Low birth weight used by me, low teen births by Ayamoye, and the information from Chapter 34 of your text. What is the common denominator that link all these variables and explain the patterns found in the upper eastern part of the Lower Peninsula? At first, when I was looking at this question, I thought it was population density, which certainly is consistent with those trends because there's a very low population density in the northeast of part of the state. But it didn't really make sense. I couldn't figure out how those were related. But then I thought about how that very high concentration of elderly persons, and I saw the graph in chapter 34 of the high concentration of elderly people that live in that area, and that would account for the low. That would explain the low LQ for anything birth related, low birth weight and teen birth because they're not having kids up there, and it would also explain the low median income because they're all retired and any income they have is non-employment income, which isn't very much. So, yes. So my final answer for number 7 is the high percentage of elderly persons in their population would be the factor, the common denominator that explains why all those 3 variables are so low in their LQs. Population density is also a low LQ there, but it doesn't explain, maybe it does, but not as well as the percentage of elderly people. All right, that is my exam. Sorry for rambling and that didn't make any sense. Sorry. Thank you.